This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
So our first speaker is Megan Steller. Megan is an artist manager, writer and producer based in Melbourne. Her online magazine, Rehearsal, is rapidly becoming a leading platform for music students, providing mentoring opportunities and promoting honest discussion around mental health and success in the classical music industry. As a journalist, Megan has been published in Limelight magazine and The Music and works as a freelance manager for several major ensembles and organisations.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much to both of you for having me. It's a real honour to be here. I am not an academic, though I would like to be, but I'm very stoked to be here to talk about my work so far and where I see classical music journalism specifically going in the future. And I want to just say early on, I've been quite sick over the past 24 hours, so if I have to leave, it's me, it's not you. So I've been given quite a wide description of what today can be about, and I hope that we can have a little bit of a conversation, because this is about criticism, and that is so incredibly personal to so many different people. So if you're happy to chat with me, that'd be awesome. Thank you. So everything that I'll talk about today comes specifically from an industry knowledge of the classical music sector, but there should be some crossover opportunities to discuss other artistic industries and where they're going. So my background, quite briefly, is as a pianist. I did my undergrad as a piano major. I almost immediately abandoned it because I wasn't very good at it. I was a bit good and was never going to go anywhere with it, unfortunately. So I knew that quite early on in my studies, so I began to write. And I got my first internship with Limelight magazine when I was in my first year of university. That was just a cold call to the editor at the time, who was Francis Merson back then, who acknowledged that I was in Melbourne, so let me kind of shack up with Maxim Boone, who was the then online editor, working from his house in Collingwood. And I went over twice a week, and for no money wrote about 12 to 15 pieces of journalism every single week for about just over a year and a half. And that opportunity kind of led me into starting Rehearsal magazine, which I'll talk a little about later on. And from the beginnings of Rehearsal, every other opportunity I've received since then it has opened up as a result of that online publication, whether it's been in artistic management, which is where I spend most of my time now, or in any other speaking, writing opportunities. So today, in my kind of 40-ish minutes or so, I'd like to talk about 5 things. Criticism and its place in modern music writing, which I'm taking to include everything from pre-concert talks and program notes, any kind of op-ed opportunities, everything in there where it belongs within that set. I'd like to talk about jargon and the challenges of writing about music for audiences, which hopefully shall cross over to every other artistic medium that we write about. Content creation and how to make a career as a freelancer. Then building a new platform and how I started Rehearsal magazine, and kind of for the first time in front of an audience where that is at right now. And finally, the practicalities of writing now about music, and specifically classical music and art music, when we're living in kind of a post-Me Too era, and what that means for traditional forms that are kind of being held accountable now after quite a period of them not being held up to a modern lens. So as I said, if you want to jump in at any point, that'd be great, because I'll get sick of my own voice after a little while. So let's be, that was everything. This is not useful, this is just good things that I found on the internet. And also I haven't seen this video, but I would love to hear what they're talking about. That would be very insightful. So criticism very generally is something that we talk a lot about, and it's a bit of a form that we kind of love to hate, and we can't really place its usefulness sometimes, particularly in music now, where we don't see repeat performances as often as we used to. Potentially music theatre it's still useful when you critique a show in its kind of first run and it goes on for 6 months, but often now in opera, as an opera manager, we are facing the problem now where companies can't afford to do more than, say, 2 or 3 iterations of a show. So what is the use in that sense? So I wanted to ask, if I may, do you seek out criticism in your chosen field? Is that something you look for? Can I ask where you look for it? Is it like all internet-based, or is it in print?
Well, fine art's predominantly internet-based.
Yeah.
Not a huge amount in print, like in newspapers. It's
Right.
advertising.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in any other music theatre, drama? All online? Yeah. The Age? Yeah, totally. Totally. Absolutely. And is it something, do you read it out of, just out of general interest, or because you know the artists? Both. Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes write criticism, only for classical music, but I only occasionally read it now. And I've had this kind of funny relationship with criticism since I started, and I was very, very anti any kind of criticism when I was beginning, because I was coming from a student lens, I suppose, and I was very nervous about the idea of seeing my name and then a negative adjective, following it. And so when I started Rehearsal magazine, I would tell everybody that never, ever, ever will this online space include criticism, because of that fear. And I think that's changed the more I've written criticism, and the more that I've read about it, and the more I see that there is like a legitimate and useful space for it in the classical music world. What I wonder now when I'm writing criticism or when I'm reading it, many of my very good friends and colleagues write for The Age and for other kind of the limelight and reputable classical music sources. What I wonder is whether it is still relevant for classical music artists, and for the progression, I suppose, of the form in general. People don't buy CDs anymore, and so when recordings were reviewed, that was a useful thing to move the sale of CDs. Now we don't need to. We have Spotify and Apple Music, so we don't need to be looking for CD criticism. And as I said, the opportunity for performances is diminishing and diminishing. So why do we need criticism? And that's not something I have an answer to, but is something that I think about quite a lot. The criticism that I often discuss with people is word of mouth criticism, and where that fits within the broader kind of space that criticism sits in. And when you go to see something that you love or that you hate or that you have a strong opinion about, telling somebody about it and discussing that within your cohort changes whether they'll go to see it or not. And I think now perhaps that holds more, that is more important than the column inches that we receive as journalists. Because many of the newspapers and magazines are, if they keep their classical music criticism at all, they have such a small amount of inches that there's very little you can do other than advertise in that space. That's something that you could say, here is what happened, and there's very little room for analysis, and that's something that I've been noticing as a reader specifically. But also when you get 200 words, which is quite a lot, it's quite a generous portion, there's very little that you can do with that in terms of following up with analysis. Something that a very close colleague of mine who is the classical music critic for The Age says that sometimes when he includes a final question about whether or not a new piece of work needs further analysis or it needs further workshopping, people often write in complaining about that because there isn't the space to acknowledge why or how that will take place. And so I think now online makes more sense for criticism. It makes more sense because you have much more, you have a much wider berth, I suppose, for like where your opinions can go, but also how much you can write about them. And that is one of the reasons that I started rehearsal. You know, it wasn't for criticism, but it was because I get to say if I wanted to write 10,000 words or 4. It's totally my call, and that's why we're seeing more and more criticism, good quality criticism from writers, from Australian writers, building their own spaces online. There's a bunch of new journals, online, offline, predominantly online, making way for a new era of criticism that I think is really exciting and kind of points out to musicians and to artists making their work that there's space for political discussion and acknowledgement of context, I suppose, that we never did see, we might not have seen in the same way that we have the opportunity to do now. And I think we often want critics to get it wrong. We love seeing critics get it wrong because it's something that we can kind of push back at. There's that famous example, if you were an opera fan or you know the work La Bohème, when it was originally reviewed, a very famous reviewer at the time said, La Bohème will leave no great trace upon the history of our lyric theatre, which I think we now like to go back and look at and acknowledge how wrong that was. But in saying that, then why did we need that to be written in the first place? And I think that's something worth thinking about when we talk about criticism overall. Does anyone write criticism? Does everyone write criticism? Everyone writes criticism? Yeah, absolutely. Is it mainly online now? Yeah. Do you find, is there a difference how you write for an audience that is reading offline to an audience reading online? Yeah. So it's a space thing predominantly? Sure. Sure. Yes, absolutely. So there's more of a space for an analysis and your thoughts as a critic when you're writing online. I think that's an interesting space to think about where criticism can go next, and I think it's an incredibly useful tool. But you've mentioned your audience, and I wanted to speak a little about jargon, which is something that I have been thinking about quite a lot, particularly since I went to Darmstadt, the new music school, last year to write and to provide criticism. And in the art music world, that is it's incredibly academic, it's incredibly technical, and something that I have clipped and put above my computer for every time I do any kind of writing about music or art or anything at all really, is from John Ruskin, and it says, "The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way." And that's something that I think about every time I sit down at the computer to write, because it is the easiest way of describing something that makes the biggest impact a lot of the time, considering your audience. When I went to Darmstadt to write predominantly about music that I didn't necessarily have a good academic knowledge of, something that I found was I worried about the words that I had to describe something too complex for my vocabulary. And so I wrote a long piece that was written about in the Cambridge Journal, and it was about asking stupid questions. And it was about asking stupid questions in the context of art music, which opens itself up for rigorous academic discussion, but doesn't necessarily open itself up for audience engagement in a very kind of present way, because it's a difficult thing to listen to, I think, in many ways, for an uneducated ear, if I can say that. I would include my ear in that category. And so something that I looked at with the musicians there was how they would describe their music, the music they were writing that is more complex than a simple handful of words can describe. And this piece made a few waves because it's very irregular at an event like that to have someone willing to say, I don't understand. And I think what was really useful for me and for the people that I was working with was this idea that if you're open to say, I don't know what that means, or I can't, I don't have a logical response to the piece that I just heard or the film that I just watched, you're able to engage in a much more efficient conversation about how to describe music. There is that dancing about architecture quip, writing about music is like. And I think that in many ways, particularly when the music that you're listening to is not within our regular vocabulary, can be, that makes a lot of sense. There is the very famous interviewer, Larry King. He often talks about the technique that he uses the most and is the most useful with getting answers out of particularly, say, scientists, people that he doesn't necessarily understand. He doesn't understand their work on first look. He asks the silliest question he can possibly think of, and that gets the quickest answer. And when he was speaking with a pilot, he obviously has been on a flight before. He probably flies much more than you or I. He sat down with this pilot and said, when you take off, do you know if it's going to stay in the air? And I think that's such a brilliant question. And the pilot kind of sat and thought about it and said, the plane will leave the ground, definitely. I can be sure of that. And then I don't know. And there is, obviously a lot more, if we're going to talk about physics and things, you hope that the plane is going to stay in the air with more surety than he kind of expressed. But I like that idea that if you ask the silliest question, you get a really complex and interesting answer. So when I interview now, which I do with, many times a week. I came from an interview this morning where I work at the Recital Centre on their podcast. I try and think of the seemingly easiest questions, the questions that a child would ask of a famous violinist or of an international conductor, because those are the questions that we have when we sit in an audience. When I interview people from disciplines that I am not from, so dance or visual art, I ask my questions, which aren't necessarily the most academic questions. They're not the questions that are going to win me any awards, but they're the questions that I hope when I send my writing out to the audience that I know it is. So they're people that love art, they're people that love music, but they're people like me who don't necessarily know or practice. They're the ones that make me a conduit between those two people, the audience and the artist. And that's become my philosophy in a really serious way, particularly since Darmstadt. Because I suppose what I learnt there was that people that you think are smarter than you, which is, for me, everyone in this room, I'm able to... They are able to answer me in a much clearer way if I don't try and aim for that level of question asking. I think also that the New York Times critic said it very, very well when asked about what his job entailed, when he said, music, especially purely instrumental music, resists being described in language. It's very hard to convey sounds through words. And perhaps that's what we most love about music, that it's beyond description, deeper than words. Yet the poor music critic has to try. Musicians can use a precise terminology to describe music, but I have to assume that these complex terms chromatic harmony, canon, tone row will baffle the majority of readers, even amateur music lovers who go to concerts all the time. Our task is to try and describe music in accessible language and everyday images, which is, of course, always hard. The opportunity I've found to use technical language that I have from my years as a practicing musician is relatively sparse as a working writer, and that's outside of university doors, of course. So I think for me it's been important, once I've become steeped in the language, which I have been, through education and through time and through experience, is to spend a lot of time thinking about how to write for your aunt. And that is my, that's the person that I look for when I'm writing anything that could quickly become purely technical. So when I write about, say, a string quartet performing for Musica Viva, I take on the lens of someone who wants to know but doesn't have a pre-existing knowledge of what they're about to do. And so I can change my language to suit the audience so it makes a lot more sense. I've sat through thousands of pre-concert talks that lose me immediately. And maybe I know the language, but when you're about to sit through a piece that goes for 45 minutes, you need something to, help you get all the way through it to the end. And that, I think, is my most important job as a speaker and as a writer. It's to give someone an anchor to help push them all the way through. Obviously, that's not about criticism, but I think criticism is the same, because once you leave journals, academic journals, and places online that are frequented only by practicing artists, the majority of our writing is read by people who don't necessarily have that vocabulary. And so, as I said, that has been the most important change for my writing, is thinking about, in my case, my aunt, someone who doesn't understand what, maybe she doesn't know what a symphony means, and what does a symphony mean? But I get to use all of my creative thinking to find ways of describing that music just for her. And that means if I'm speaking for the MSO, I know everybody's following me, and that has become really important. Now, speaking of, they're getting more and more unrelated, I'm sorry. I do think they're funny, though. So kind of speaking of those few examples I gave of the work that I do, I speak and write for the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra and Musica Viva and the Melbourne Recital Centre. Those are my predominant places of income, I suppose, as a writer. In a given week, that doesn't necessarily mean I can pay my rent. And so I spend my 9 to 5 hours working as an artist manager, which basically means personal representation for, I have 41 artists, and they are opera singers predominantly, conductors and instrumentalists. I only have 3 instrumentalists, and they're 2 guitarists and a harpist, so that's a bit strange, but that's not regular as an artist manager. But that's how I make the majority of my income, and then the rest is supplemented by the writing and speaking work. And most of the writers I know can't make the majority of their income just as a critic for one paper. Please do shout out if you do, because that's amazing. My colleague that I mentioned earlier, Maxim Boone, who gave me my first job and is now about to start as the editor of Time Out Sydney, he does the same thing as I do, and he supplements with all kinds of different creative outlets, including the podcast that we make together at the Recital Centre. I flagged this passage in one of my favourite books, How to Write About Contemporary Art, and it is quite small, but it packs a lot of information in that just says something good about the job that I like to think about when I write, but also when I consider the different hats that I wear as a music writer. The art writer's job must be to enhance, not destroy, the pleasure of art. Good art writers never sound as if they are struggling to cook up something to say, or miming words spoken before by someone else, or clinging to jargon to weigh their words with gravitas. Intimidating the reader is never their goal. Good art writing knows that art is meaningful, therefore meaning does not have to be forced upon it, only discovered, enjoyed, and put into plain words. And I think that relates to any kind of art writing that we do. And when I look at the different buckets that my work falls into, as I'm sure many of you have those different buckets that you have to consider in terms of being creatively fulfilled, but also paying your rent and things like that, that is something that I come back to often and over again. Maxim, I think, is interesting as an example, and I often look to him. He began his career as a composer in the UK, moving into teaching, and then finally landing in criticism, which is something he's been doing as the chief classical critic of the age after Clive O'Connell left. And that's something I think when you consider whether you're ready or not to make criticism, which is something that I have been thinking about for a long time. When am I ready to critique another's work? And I wanted to throw that out, if you're happy to talk about that a little bit. Everyone, I think almost everyone nodded when I said, do you write criticism? I wonder if anybody's happy to tell me when they felt comfortable, like when they felt ready, or do you not feel comfortable and you have to do it anyway? Like I'm quite interested in that conceptually. Yeah.
Well, I remember I've been writing film criticism for about maybe 16, 17 years. And I'm exactly the same. I was like, who am I to say this is a good movie or a bad movie,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
to disregard the intention of the filmmaker?
Yes.
So I just spent 6 months watching movies,
Yeah.
like watching film, like getting acquainted with film history,
Mm.
and to be in a position where I thought I had the bare minimum of film history background
Yes.
to be able to sort of like trace the genealogy of the film through my criticism,
Mm-hmm.
and felt comfortable doing so.
Mm.
Yeah, so it was studying a lot of film history,
Yes.
like watching the key films in history from not only Hollywood but different film industries around the world.
Mm.
So like do my homework kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And it has a little bit to do with kind of knowing your context now, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
And you feel like you have a good overview.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. I
awesome.
was in my 20s and I felt,
Yeah.
I had to do that.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Is there anyone else? Because that's a great example. About knowing when you're ready to write any kind of criticism. Anyone else? book in particular or go to the theatre in particular, how much knowledge do you have of what you're about to read or see or experience? Before you actually experience it, do you allow yourself context of that thing before you go to it?
For me, there's there's a few different groundings of authority for the critics, and they don't always map into the same place as being one place. I think we talk about knowledge, but knowledge is really only one form of being adequate.
But then the editor told me, and I will always be thankful to her, she was like, wait, go to a screening with children. So I went to a screening with children, and my view of the movie changed because it worked for, I mean, children had a lovely time, they were laughing, and they like fart jokes and all of that. So, yeah, so I guess when it's not, I'm talking specifically about film, when it's not a movie that's intended for you as an audience, I think that's when you leave your eye out and your own experience out of the piece, I think. And yeah, and in my case it was children's movies, which are super tricky to write about. Yeah, and it was a somewhat like positive review of Ice Age. First it was like, because I mean I was young and snobbish at the time. I was like, oh, what is this piece of Hollywood crap, blah blah blah. And so I guess that was an example of that.
That's a great example. Yeah, I like that. Go where the audience is intended for. I think we all have that kind of cross-discipline where you go to something intended for children. Yes, and you get to experience it with them, you get to hear how they respond. That's an awesome example. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I think that it's a good task anyway to try and like react from the outside, even if you're not.
Yeah, sure. Like just
General.
general.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's that 1% who's probably a person who takes it really, but doing it as a task is good, even if you're not.
Yeah, sure.
Just step back and see from like being a professional
Yeah,
I think it works.
absolutely. Yeah, we have to try both, right? And I suppose when you're putting your like process into it, like that's very personal, but it also kind of shows an audience how much you've thought about it, which says something as well, something really useful for the audience. Oh, I'm back on the mic. Sorry that I wandered away from it. I'm really running out of time. Sorry. What I was going to talk about was Rehearsal Magazine just a little bit, which is the platform that's really unrelated, but I thought that was really funny, so I thought I'd throw it in there. Rehearsal Magazine is a project that I started at university when I was trying to figure out where my voice could fit, and I had this kind of overwhelming worry that I wouldn't ever be able to write at the standard that I wanted to write about, but I knew I wanted to write and I wanted to share my voice and I wanted to share other people's work, and Rehearsal very quickly became a platform for everybody else, and I very rarely wrote anything on it myself because it very quickly took off for music students, and it was a space that I felt like I could commission pieces, and I experimented and I talked about all kinds of things that were a little bit controversial, like institutionalized music teaching and things, and they caused a bit of a stir, and it was a very exciting platform when I was still at university as a way of letting people have a voice. It also kind of, you had articles by Lung next to an article by a first-year piano student, and I thought that was really exciting because it kind of gives everybody a really even platform to speak about their experience, and that was a really exciting prospect. And as it got bigger, it got more and more attention from companies like Universal Music, and the level of interviews got better, and I continued to publish pieces by university students and late high school students about what they were experiencing and where they wanted to go, and it was a really lovely way to get everybody onto the same page. It has since, it's on hiatus at the moment, so there's nothing new up there. But what I would love to do with it next is turn it into a purely mentoring platform. And this is not something I've said out loud to people before, so I would love your suggestions after or at another time. I would like to turn it into a purely mentoring platform, because what I was finding as I was publishing more and more, and it was up and running for about 3.5 years before I put it on hiatus, was that people were writing to me with their press releases, and I was publishing things that felt like advertising. I was still interviewing, and I still thought, you know, there is still a very clear voice with objectives, and that is still coming across. But everything was to a deadline that was somebody else's PR budget. And that's kind of what got me offside a little bit with my own platform. And now I'm hoping to take it back to its roots, which is musicians that are very far into their career and very young musicians hoping to, you know, get there and bringing them together. And so the kind of next step, I suppose, is to have a little bit like a very mentors, people who could be mentors can apply, and people who want a mentor can apply, and I can match them. And that's something that I think hopefully can move into a platform like this journal and move into a space where it can be interdisciplinary, where we can match young art writers with experienced art writers and dance writers, etc. And not even writers, practitioners, people that work in admin like me, people who want to build this industry, I suppose, with the help of a community. So that's the next step, and I thought I'd share that with you as a way of putting it into the world and seeing what happens. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that if you'd like to get in touch. And then finally, it's right on 11, so I won't go much further. But I wanted to mention that writing now, we were talking about context a little bit before, and I think now in the music world, every week there is another undoing of a powerful man who has done terrible things. The most recent was Placido Domingo, and that is something that in my job as personal management to artists, that's something that I deal with all the time, not to that extent, but I look after my artists in a way that that means that they are protected, and not many people in Australia have personal management, so it is something that I'm thinking about quite a lot, how to best look after the people that we work with, our colleagues, whether it's in whatever discipline you're in, how best to be an advocate for the people that you're working with. And I think it's important now that every piece of writing that we do is acknowledging the difficulties of working in an industry that has a lot of bad behaviour. It's also built on a very patriarchal kind of situation. We've been doing these same operas that look at the violence of women for a very, very long time, and it feels like we're only just starting to see that come up in reviews. I recently read reviews of Thoroughly Modern Millie, and it's now, looking through a 2019 lens, it's an incredibly racist piece of theatre, a lot of throughout a lot of that musical, and I think it's really important now that as critics, we acknowledge, and as writers and as managers and as whatever we do in our practice, we acknowledge and try and make change the best we can to protect this community. And that's why I'm very excited to be part of this, because this is building a community that is interdisciplinary, and I've never had that opportunity before to speak with people from the book world and from the film world. And I think this is a great step in the right direction for all of us, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you all in the future. So thank you very much for having me and following that wild journey. I very much appreciate it, and I hope you liked the memes. Thank you.